The laughter cracked across the driveway like ice breaking under a careless step. 60 grand, my stepmother announced, patting the hood of her brand-new pickup as if it were a prize horse. Then she tilted her chin toward my old sedan. And that thing, what, 2,000 if you're lucky? My brother snorted. If that? I felt the heat rise, the familiar burn of being weighed and found wanting until my cousin the mechanic stopped walking. He crouched, ran a hand along my door, and went very still. This, he said slowly, is a surveillance vehicle, reinforced frame, ballistic glass, worth more than your house. The laughter died where it stood. The party was supposed to be easy. That was the lie I told myself on the drive down, easy like a well-worn road, easy like a promise you know better than to test. December had laid a thin crust of frost over the lawns, and the houses along my father's street wore their lights the way people wear smiles at church, bright, practiced, a little tired. I parked at the curb because the driveway was already full, engines ticking as they cooled, exhaust ghosting into the cold. My sedan looked exactly like it always did, dull gray, a decade old, the kind of car nobody remembers. That was the point. I shut the door and felt the familiar weight of it heavier than it should be, the seal closing with a quiet authority that never announced itself. I slipped the keys into my coat and stood there a moment breathing, letting the night settle me. Inside the house hummed with that particular holiday noise, forks clinking a radio, crooning something about home for Christmas, voices overlapping like scarves tossed on a chair. My stepmother Carol was in her element. She moved through the room with a glass of wine that never seemed to empty, directing traffic, assigning seats, narrating the evening as if it were a show she had produced. My father hovered near the doorway between the kitchen and the den, nodding at people, smiling when spoken to, retreating when things sharpened. "Hey," my brother said, clapping me on the shoulder a beat too hard. "You made it." He smelled like cologne and confidence, the kind you buy in bulk when approval has always been on sale for you. "I did," I said, and handed my gift to my aunt. Simple things are easier to place. We ate. We talked about weather and football and gas prices. We laughed at the safe jokes. I kept my answers small. Administrative work, consulting, travel sometimes. Nothing that would invite inventory. Carol watched me the way some people watch a card table waiting for a tell. After dessert, she suggested we all step outside to see the surprise. The word carried the weight of a drum roll. Coats were fetched. The door opened. Cold poured in like a truth no one had ordered. The pickup sat in the driveway under the floodlight, black paint shining like wet stone. Carol beamed. "Go on," she said. "Isn't she beautiful?" She ran a hand along the fender, careful not to smudge. $60,000, she announced to the semicircle of relatives. Every bell and whistle. There it was, the number, the measure, the yardstick she loved to carry. She turned then, eyes finding my car at the curb as if by instinct. "And you," she said lightly, the way people do when they mean something heavy. "What did you drive in with again?" She squinted. "Oh, that." A laugh bubbled up. "What do you think that's worth?" 2,000 if that." My brother laughed because he always did. If that, he echoed, enjoying the harmony. There's a particular feeling when the old script starts again. It's not surprise. It's a tightening, a calculation. How much of this do I absorb? How much do I refuse? I stood still. My breath fogged the air. Somewhere someone shifted their weight. "I like it," Carol added, as if kindness were an accessory she could put on. "Practical." Practical is what people say when they don't want to say small. My cousin Jake had been quiet all night. He was leaning against the fence, hands in his pockets, the kind of man who listens with his eyes. He straightened and walked toward my car without a word. He didn't circle it like a shopper. He approached it like a professional, slow and exact. He crouched, peered under the rocker panel, tapped the glass with a knuckle. His face changed, not shock, not delight. Recognition. Jake, Carol said, a laugh hitching. "What are you doing?" He stood and brushed his hands on his jeans, just looking. He reached for the door handle, tested it. The door opened an inch and stopped, heavy as a promise. He nodded to himself. Yeah, what my brother said," the smile wobbling. Jake turned to the group. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This isn't a beater," he said. "It's a surveillance vehicle. Reinforced frame, ballistic glass. See the thickness that seal." He tapped the window. "Not decorative. And that weight you feel when the door closes, that's not age." The night seemed to lean in. Carol laughed once sharp. "Oh, come on." Jake looked at her not unkindly. "I'm not guessing," he said. "I work on cars for a living. This thing's worth more than your house." Silence is a thing with edges. It cut the laughter clean away. My father's breath caught. My brother's mouth opened, then closed. Someone muttered, "Is that true?" And someone else said, "What does that mean?" Words piled up and went nowhere. I didn't smile. I didn't explain. I stood there and let the truth do what it does when you don't rush it settle. Carol recovered first because she always did. "Well," she said too brightly, "isn't that something? Guess we all have our little surprises." She took a sip of wine that sloshed. Still, she added, as if unable to help herself, "You don't need a truck like this for what?" I asked gently. She blinked. My father shifted his feet. Jake stepped back, giving me the space the way men who know their lanes do. "For normal things," Carol finished. I nodded once. "You're right," I said. "You don't." The cold crept into my gloves. I felt the familiar steadiness in my chest, the one I rely on when rooms tilt. I had not planned to say more tonight. Plans are useful until they aren't. Behind us, the radio inside the house started another song, bells chiming like a countdown. The driveway lights buzzed, the pickup gleamed. My sedan waited patient, unremarkable, holding its weight without asking to be admired. My father cleared his throat. Let's get back inside," he said, already turning. As we moved, I caught Jake's eye. He gave me a small nod, the kind that says, "I see you," and stepped aside. Inside, the noise returned in pieces, conversations restarting with the awkwardness of a machine after a stall. No one laughed again, not about cars, not about prices. The yardstick had snapped and everyone felt the splinter. I hung my coat and took my place at the counter, hands warming around a mug I hadn't asked for. Carol busied herself with napkins. My brother stared into his phone like it might rescue him. My father stood between rooms, a man learning the dimensions of a space he thought he knew. The night was not over. It had just changed its shape. When the room finds a new silence, old memories have a way of filling it. As people drifted back toward the kitchen and the den carrying plates and opinions they didn't know where to set down, I felt myself slide backward through time, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a tide goes out inch by inch, exposing what's always been there. I wasn't always the problem child. That title arrived later, quietly after my mother died, and the house learned a new rhythm. Before that, we were ordinary. My mother hummed when she cooked. My father fixed things that didn't need fixing just to keep his hands busy. I learned early that you could tell how a day would go by the sound of the screen door. Soft meant calm, hard meant brace yourself. After the funeral, the house felt too big, too many corners, too much air. My father shrank inside it like a man who had lost the map to his own rooms. Carol arrived a year later with casseroles and opinions, with a laugh that filled space the way my mother's humming once had, but sharper. She was efficient. She reorganized drawers. She reorganized us. My brother took to her immediately. She praised his shoes, his grades, the way he filled a room. Praise is currency, and he learned how to earn it. I watched and took notes. I learned what not to ask for. Carol didn't start cruel. She started comparative. "Your brother has such drive," she'd say, glancing at me. "You're more thoughtful." Thoughtful is another word people use when they don't know what else to call you. Over time, the comparisons hardened into jokes. Jokes hardened into habits. Habits hardened into the story everyone agreed to tell. At family dinners, she'd nudge my plate toward me and say, "Careful, honey," like she was worried about my health and not my place. At church, she'd whisper, "Smile more," as if joy were a duty I'd forgotten to clock in for. In parking lots, she'd comment on my clothes, practical again, that word, that made me feel like a tool you keep because it works, not because you like it. My father rarely intervened. He hated scenes. He loved peace. The trouble was, peace in our house came at a price, and I was the one paying it. When I tried to talk to him just once, he said, "She doesn't mean anything by it," and went back to tightening a bolt that didn't need tightening. I learned something then that took me years to unlearn. Silence can look like safety, but it's often just surrender wearing a coat. I grew good at becoming smaller. Not physically, Carol liked to comment on that, but socially. I answered questions with fewer words. I dressed to disappear. I learned the relief of being overlooked. If you don't attract attention, you don't attract commentary. Work became my refuge. I chose paths that valued precision over charm, competence over charisma. I learned to arrive early, leave late, and never talk about what I did unless asked directly. Especially not at home. Home was where accomplishments were weighed against Carol's yardstick, and I had no interest in watching her measure me again. The first time I brought a decent car home years ago now, she'd circled it with a practiced eye and said, "Must be nice the way people do when they mean irresponsible." I sold it 6 months later and bought something dull. I told myself it was practical. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. By the time my work required the sedan, the one Jake recognized, I had already learned the value of invisibility. Vehicles like that are designed to be forgettable. They blend. They don't invite questions. They keep people safe without demanding applause. I liked that. I liked it more than I liked explanations. Back in the kitchen, Carol laughed too loudly at something my aunt said. The sound skidded. No one laughed back. My brother hovered near the fridge pretending to read magnets. My father poured himself coffee, though it was late, his hands shaking enough to slosh. Someone asked Jake how he knew what he knew. He shrugged. "You see enough frames," he said, "you start to recognize the bones." I met his eyes and nodded my thanks. He'd always been like that, quiet, observant, uninterested in show. When we were kids, he fixed my bike chain without commentary. When I fell, he waited until I stood up before asking if I was okay. Respect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just does the job. Carol drifted over to me, then wine glass empty now smile tightened into something brittle. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "you could have mentioned it." I set my mug down carefully. "You didn't ask." She blinked, then laughed. "I'm your stepmother." "And I'm an adult," I said evenly. "Those two things can be true at the same time." Her eyes flicked to my father, searching for backup. He was watching us now, really watching, as if the shape of the room had changed, and he was trying to memorize it before it changed again. He didn't speak. That, too, was new. "I just don't understand," Carol said louder, now the room's attention tugging toward us despite itself. "Why hide something like that? What's the point?" I considered her question. It was a fair one, asked for the wrong reasons. "Some things work better when they're quiet," I said, "and some rooms aren't safe for the truth until they are." The words hung there, not accusatory, just factual. People shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The radio changed songs. My brother finally looked up. "So what do you even do?" he asked, the edge gone from his voice, replaced by something like curiosity mixed with unease. I met his gaze. He was older than me, by 2 years younger in ways that mattered. "I do my job," I said, "and I do it well." That was all I gave him. It was enough to unsettle the story he'd been telling himself. As the evening wore on, conversations restarted in smaller clusters. Carol stayed busy, a woman denied her stage, but unwilling to leave it. My father lingered near me, not speaking, just present. Presence can be an apology if you let it. I watched the clock, the second hand sweeping like a metronome. The night was moving forward, whether we were ready or not. Outside, my sedan sat at the curb, unremarkable, holding its secrets. Inside, something had cracked, not dramatically, not cleanly, but enough to let air in. I didn't know yet how this would end. I only knew that the old rules had failed in the driveway under a floodlight with witnesses. And once rules fail in public, they don't recover in private without a reckoning. My father caught my eye then and jerked his head toward the back porch. A small motion, an invitation, or a request. I wrapped my fingers around my mug, felt the warmth, and nodded once. Some conversations wait decades for their moment. This one had found its opening. The back porch light hummed when my father flipped it on a thin white halo cutting into the cold. He stepped outside, first shoulders hunched against more than the weather, and I followed, pulling the door closed behind us. The house noise softened to a muffled thrum laughter, trying to restart dishes clinking with forced normalcy. Out here, the night had room to breathe. My father leaned on the railing and stared into the yard like he might find instructions written in the frost. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Silence has different textures. This one was brittle-edged with things we had avoided for years. "I didn't know," he said finally. His voice was low, careful, the way you talk when you're unsure which words might break something. About the car, about any of it. I nodded, I figured. He winced at that, just a flicker, but I caught it. "You could have told me." I rested my forearms on the railing. The wood was cold through my sleeves. "You could have asked." He sighed a sound that carried a lifetime of deflection. "I didn't think—" "I know," I said gently. "That's the problem." We stood there, breath clouding. The yard looked smaller from this angle, hemmed in by fences and expectations. My sedan was just visible at the curb, its dull paint catching the streetlight without reflecting it. It had always been good at that, existing without calling attention to itself. "You don't have to explain," my father said, then paused as if the truth surprised him. "But I'd like to understand." I studied his profile, the familiar slope of his nose, the new lines around his mouth. Understanding isn't a switch you flip. It's a series of choices you make when the easier ones stop working. "I don't talk about work at home," I said. "Not because I'm ashamed, because it doesn't belong here." He nodded slowly. "What kind of work needs—" That he jerked his chin toward the street. "The kind that assumes things go wrong," I said, "and plans for it." That was as much as I intended to give him. Enough to frame the picture without inviting a crowd. He accepted it to his credit, though I could see the questions stacking up behind his eyes. Inside, a laugh rose too loudly and fell flat. Carol was trying again. She always did. Control is a habit like any other. You practice it until it becomes reflex. My father rubbed his hands together. "She shouldn't have said what she said," he murmured. "About the car." "No," I agreed, "she shouldn't have." He glanced at me. I should have stopped it. "Yes," I said, not unkindly. The word landed between us solid. He didn't flinch this time. Progress doesn't always look like apologies. Sometimes it looks like staying put when you'd rather retreat. We went back inside together. The room adjusted around us, conversations shifting like furniture moved an inch to accommodate a new reality. Carol glanced up, then away. My brother hovered uncertain, as if the rules he'd memorized had been rewritten without his consent. Aunt Marlene pressed a cookie into my hand. For the road, she said, her eyes warm. I thanked her and slipped it into my coat pocket. Small mercies count. Jake caught my eye from across the room and raised his eyebrows, a silent question. I shrugged. He smiled, a small one, and returned to his conversation. He had done his part without asking for credit. That mattered to me. As the evening thinned, coats were fetched and goodbyes attempted. Carol hugged people a beat too long, narrating plans for next year. My brother clapped me on the shoulder again, lighter this time. "Drive safe," he said, and meant something different than he had an hour ago. "I always do," I said. Outside, the cold had sharpened. I walked to my car alone, the crunch of gravel loud in the quiet. I unlocked the door and felt the familiar resistance, the weight settling as it closed behind me. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of leather and something clean I couldn't name. The dash lights came on, soft and steady instruments, waking without fanfare. I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, listening. Not for threats, old habits die hard, but for myself. The night was calm. The street was empty. Somewhere behind me, a house glowed with the light of a family recalibrating. When I pulled away, the car moved like it always did, smooth, unassuming, ready. I checked the mirrors, then the road muscle memory guiding the sequence. Safety isn't a feeling, it's a practice. At a stop sign, I caught my reflection in the windshield, older than I used to be, steadier than I ever thought I'd feel. I thought about all the years I'd chosen quiet over confrontation, invisibility over explanation. Those choices had kept me safe. They had also kept me small in rooms that mistook silence for consent. Tonight had shifted something. Not everything. Not neatly, but enough. I drove the long way home, past neighborhoods strung with lights and expectations, past closed shops and open gas stations, humming with late-night commerce. The road unwound, familiar and forgiving. I breathed, counting mile markers like rosary beads. Tomorrow there would be calls, questions, attempts to reframe the story. Carol would test angles. My brother would recalibrate. My father would sit with what he had seen and decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the aftermath. As for me, I would do what I always did. I would go to work, I would keep people safe, I would keep myself intact. The sedan carried me through the dark, holding its secrets, doing its job. I didn't need anyone to admire it. I needed it to work. And it did. The calls started the next morning, right on schedule. Not all at once. Truth rarely arrives like a parade, but in cautious taps, the way people knock when they're not sure they're welcome. An aunt first, her voice wrapped in concern and curiosity. Then a cousin who had been quiet at the party, now suddenly talkative. By noon, my phone had learned a new rhythm: vibration, pause, vibration again. I let most of them go to voicemail, not because I was hiding, but because I was listening. There's a difference. People reveal what they think when they don't have an audience. Some wanted reassurance. Some wanted details. A few wanted to recalibrate their place in the story before it finished writing itself. At work, the day unfolded with the calm insistence of routine, security briefings, checklists. A conversation that required fewer words than the one at my father's house had taken to derail. I like environments where rules are posted and followed. They leave less room for improvisation disguised as authority. On my lunch break, Jake texted me a picture. My car shot from a low-angle frost on the windshield like a veil. Under it, a message: "You good?" I smiled despite myself and typed back, "All good. Thanks for last night." He replied with a thumbs up. That was it. The matter to him was closed. He had identified a problem and corrected it. No performance, no aftercare, respect in its purest form. By evening, the house calls slowed. The story had made its way through the family's grapevine and settled into something people could repeat without embarrassment. Carol had a version, of course. I could hear it already, the joke gone wrong, the misunderstanding the way some men like Jake exaggerate. She would attempt to reclaim the narrative the way she always had, by sanding down the parts that didn't flatter her. She called that night. I watched the phone ring, her name lighting up the screen like a warning label. I let it ring out. When the voicemail came through, I didn't listen right away. Timing matters. I waited until I had poured a glass of water, until the apartment had settled into its quiet, until I was sure my hands wouldn't shake. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful. "Well," she said, drawing the word out. That was something. I just wanted to clear the air. You know, I was joking. I didn't mean anything by it. Families tease. It's how we show love. There it was, the oldest defense. If you object, you can't take a joke. She went on, warming to her theme. And honestly, if you didn't want people to comment, you could have said something, or driven something else. A laugh. I mean, who brings a car like that without warning? I stopped the message there. That was enough. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling to negotiate terms, to reassert control by reframing me as the unreasonable variable in an otherwise acceptable equation. I didn't call her back. My father called later, his voice steadier than it had been on the porch. "I heard from your aunt," he said, "and your uncle. People are talking." "They always do," I said. He hesitated. "Carol's upset." I waited. Silence can be instructive if you give it space. "She says you embarrassed her," he finished. I closed my eyes and counted to 3. "She embarrassed herself," I said calmly, publicly. Another pause. Longer this time. I told her that he said. The words sounded new in his mouth, like he was testing them for fit. Something in my chest loosened just a fraction. "Thank you." We talked then, not about my job, not about the car, but about smaller, truer things. About how jokes had become weapons in our house without anyone naming them. About how silence had trained everyone to accept cuts as normal. He didn't defend her. He didn't defend himself. He listened. That too was new. "I don't want to lose you," he said finally. "You won't," I said, "but I won't stay where I'm not respected." He took that in, I understand. Whether he did or not, he was closer than he'd ever been. The weekend came and went. Carol hosted a brunch she didn't invite me to. The exclusion was pointed, then dulled when people noticed. Absence has a way of becoming commentary. My brother texted a neutral question about a recipe. I answered it. Boundaries don't require scorched earth. By the following week, the story had simplified. That's what stories do when they pass through enough hands. The details blur, the truth sharpens. People stopped asking what my car was worth. They started asking how I was. It was a subtle shift, but a real one. Value had moved from objects to personhood. I saw my father again at the hardware store on Thursday evening. He was in the aisle with the fasteners, squinting at a shelf like it had personally offended him. When he noticed me, he smiled, a small, uncertain smile, but genuine. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. We stood there among bins of screws and bolts, the ordinary choreography of repair surrounding us. He cleared his throat. "Carol's truck needs a bedliner," he said. "She wants the expensive one." I raised an eyebrow. He huffed a laugh. I told her we could wait. Progress is sometimes a sentence that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. We walked to the register together. He paid. Outside, the sky had that winter blue clarity that makes everything look possible for a few minutes. He turned to me, awkward hands in his pockets. "I'm proud of you," he said, then rushed on as if afraid the word might run away. "Not because of the car, or the job. Just you." It wasn't perfect, it wasn't poetic, it was enough. I drove home in the dusk headlights, cutting clean paths through the gathering dark. The sedan hummed, steady and sure. Inside it, I felt the shift complete, not loud, not triumphant, but settled. Power had moved quietly from the people who measured worth with price tags to the person who refused to be measured that way again. Truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just changes who gets to speak. There is a moment after a storm when the air feels rinsed. Not clean exactly, debris still litters the ground, but clearer, lighter, as if the sky has decided to give you a break. That was how the days after the party felt. People moved carefully. Words were chosen, then revised mid-sentence. The old confidence Carol carried like a handbag had been set down somewhere, and she didn't quite know how to pick it back up without everyone noticing the tremor in her hand. She tried, of course. Control doesn't vanish because it's challenged. It adapts. She began hosting smaller gatherings, selectively rehearsing her smile. When I was mentioned, she used a new tone, brighter, thinner. "She's doing very well for herself," she'd say, as if that were the headline. The sentence carried no details, which was the point. Vagueness can be a shield when specifics no longer cooperate. I heard all this secondhand. I didn't attend. Boundaries once drawn require maintenance. You don't redraw them every time someone tests the line. You stand still and let the test fail. My brother called midweek. It surprised me. He wasn't the type to reach out without a reason he could explain to himself. So he said after the initial pleasantries had run out, "People are saying stuff." "People always do," I replied. He exhaled. I didn't know he said, and for the first time it sounded like he meant it as an apology rather than a defense. "About you. About your life." I considered my answer. There are truths you tell to be understood and truths you tell to set a boundary. This was the latter. "You didn't ask," I said, "and I didn't offer." A pause. "Why not?" "Because it's mine," I said simply. "Not a punchline, not a prop." He was quiet then, and I let him be. Silence, when chosen, can be generous. The opportunity to say more came a few days later at my father's request. He asked if I would meet him for coffee, just us. Not at the house. Neutral ground. That mattered. We chose a diner halfway between our places, a square room with cracked vinyl booths, and a counter that had seen better decades. The waitress called everyone honey and meant it. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our mugs. My father watched me the way he used to when I was learning to ride a bike, alert, worried, hopeful. "Carol's having a hard time," he said, not as an excuse but as context. "I'm sure," I replied. "She feels exposed." I nodded. That's what happens when jokes don't land. He stirred his coffee, though it didn't need it. "She wants to talk, clear the air." I met his eyes. "I'm willing," I said, "but not to negotiate my dignity." He absorbed that, then smiled faintly. "You always were good with lines." The meeting happened the following Sunday afternoon. Carol chose the living room, of course. Soft, light throw pillows arranged like witnesses. She offered tea. I declined and sat straight-backed on the edge of the couch, hands folded loosely in my lap. My father took the armchair, a buffer and a bridge. Carol began with a sigh calibrated for sympathy. "I've been thinking," she said. About what I said, how it came across. I waited. I never meant to hurt you, she continued. It was just teasing, families tease. There it was again. I let the silence stretch, not cruelly, just long enough to make space for a different sentence to appear. When it didn't, I supplied one. Teasing requires consent, I said. You didn't have mine. She blinked. I didn't know. You knew, I said gently. You just didn't think it mattered. My father shifted, but he didn't interrupt. Carol's mouth tightened. If you'd told us what you do, she said, a note of irritation sneaking through, none of this would have happened. I smiled, small and tired. My worth doesn't depend on disclosure, I said. And my work isn't a shield you get to use when you want to be kind. She flushed. So what are you saying? I took a breath. This was the heart of it, the place where standards are named. I'm saying this, I said. You don't comment on my body. You don't comment on my possessions. You don't make me the butt of jokes to entertain a room. If you do, I will leave. Every time. That's extreme, she said. No, I replied. It's clear. My father nodded once slow. It's fair, he added, surprising both of us. Carol looked between us, recalculating. Control hates recalculation. I'm your stepmother, she said, reaching for authority like a familiar tool. And I'm not a child, I said. Those roles don't cancel each other out. The room went quiet. Somewhere a clock ticked, counting the seconds of a new arrangement settling into place. Carol set her teacup down with care. Fine, she said. The word wasn't gracious, but it was acceptance adjacent. I'll try. Thank you, I said. Gratitude costs nothing and confers nothing. It just marks the moment. When I stood to leave, my father walked me to the door. You did good, he murmured. You didn't scorch the earth. I don't need ashes, I said. I need ground I can stand on. Outside, the afternoon was pale and honest. I got into my car and let the engine idle, feeling the familiar steadiness beneath me. Saying just enough is a skill. It takes practice to resist the urge to over-explain to perform your pain, so others will validate it. I had done that work already quietly over years. Today I had simply used it. Standards are not punishments. They are invitations to do better, to be better, or to step aside. I had extended one. What Carol and my brother and even my father chose to do with it was up to them. I pulled into traffic, the road opening ahead. The sedan merged smoothly, unremarkable as ever, carrying me forward. Some truths are loud. The ones that last tend to be spoken at a normal volume by someone who knows exactly where they stand. It was colder the next time my father and I spoke alone, the kind of cold that settles into joints and makes you aware of every year you've lived. He asked me to come by the house on a weekday evening when Carol was out at a book club she rarely missed. The specificity of that detail told me he wanted the room quiet, not just in sound, but in influence. The house looked smaller without company. Lamps replaced overhead lights. The television was off. My father stood in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, rinsing a mug that was already clean. Some habits don't know when to retire. We sat at the table where I'd done homework decades earlier, the wood marked with the ghosts of old spills and projects. He folded his hands and looked at them as if they might explain him better than words. I keep thinking about that night, he said, about the driveway. I nodded. So do I. I didn't like the way I felt, he admitted. Standing there, hearing it happen again and not stopping it. Again, the word mattered. It acknowledged a pattern without my having to draw the map. I thought keeping the peace was my job, he went on. I thought if I didn't make waves, things would settle. They settled on me, I said softly. He winced. Yes. We let that sit. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed tires whispering over asphalt. I was proud of your brother because it was easy, he said after a while. He fit the picture I had. I didn't know what to do with you because you didn't. I looked at him, really looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike and also taught me inadvertently how to disappear. Pictures aren't plans, I said. And children aren't proofs. He nodded, eyes wet, now unguarded. I'm sorry, he said. The words came out plain, unadorned, no qualifiers. I'm sorry I let her talk to you that way. I'm sorry I laughed sometimes. I'm sorry I didn't ask. Apologies don't erase the past, but they change the future's posture. I felt something unclench in my chest. Thank you, I said. That matters. He cleared his throat. I don't need to know everything about your work, he said, careful. But I want you to know, I see you. Not the car. You. I smiled, a real one, small but steady, that's enough. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His grip was tentative, respectful, as if asking permission. I let it rest there. Carol is going to test this, he said, the boundaries. I expect that, I replied. I won't let her test them on you, he said, surprising me again. Not anymore. Promises are weather. They're meaningful in the moment, but you wait to see how they behave over time. Still hearing it said, changed the room's climate. We talked then about ordinary things, his knees, the price of lumber, a neighbor's dog that had learned how to open gates. It felt like relearning a language we'd both half forgotten. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door and held it open, not rushing, not filling the space with instructions. Drive safe, he said. I always do, I replied, and this time it felt like a shared understanding, not a warning. In the weeks that followed, the changes were small but consistent. At a family birthday, Carol caught herself mid-sentence and redirected. At another gathering, my brother shut down a joke before it found me. My father introduced me without commentary, just my name. Each moment was a stitch. Together they held. I noticed how my body responded, shoulders lower, breath easier. Safety isn't just about locks and glass. It's about predictability, about knowing the rules won't change to amuse someone else. One afternoon, my father stopped by my place with a bag of groceries he didn't need to bring. He set it on the counter and said, I told Carol we're not doing car talk anymore. I raised an eyebrow. All cars. Yours, he said, and anybody else's. I laughed. He did too. It felt earned. Later, as we stood by the window watching dusk gather, he gestured toward the street. That thing of yours, he said. It's impressive. I followed his gaze, then shook my head gently. It's just a tool, I said. It does what it's supposed to do. He nodded. So do you. When he left, he closed the door softly. Consideration is a language you learn by practice. He was studying hard. That night I sat with a cup of tea and let the quiet be quiet. Not the brittle silence of avoidance, but the settled kind that comes after something has been said and received. The driveway incident had cracked the old arrangement open. What filled the space afterward was choice, mine, my father's, even Carol's, in her own limited way. I wasn't naive. Change has a half-life. It decays if you don't tend it. But I had drawn my lines and spoken my truths at a normal volume without spectacle. That mattered. I went to bed knowing something fundamental had shifted. Not because anyone had been humiliated, but because someone had been honest. Because a father had chosen clarity over comfort. Because a daughter had stopped auditioning for a role she never wanted. The house slept, the street slept, and in the quiet I felt the steadiness of ground beneath me finally even. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way it always does in places that have learned not to trust sudden warmth. Snow retreated into gray piles along the curb. Lawns reappeared patchy and patient. By the time spring hinted at itself, the story of that end-of-year party had already finished its run through the family. It came back to me trimmed of excess, simplified into something people could hold without cutting themselves. Most of them no longer mentioned the price of anything. At a cousin's retirement dinner, someone asked how my drive had been instead of what I drove. At Easter, an aunt pulled me aside and said, "You seem lighter," as if weight were finally a metaphor people understood. No one brought up Carol's truck. No one brought up my sedan. Objects had lost their power to lead the conversation. Carol adjusted in her own way. She became careful, then polite, then, on her better days, neutral. Neutral is an underrated virtue. It leaves room for other people to exist without commentary. She didn't apologize again, not directly, but she stopped trying to reclaim the moment with jokes that cut sideways. When she spoke to me, it was about recipes or weather or a show she'd watched. We weren't close. We were civil. For some families, that is a hard-won piece. My brother surprised me most. He called one afternoon and asked if I wanted to grab lunch. No agenda, no audience. We sat at a place that served burgers the size of plates and fries you could smell from the parking lot. Halfway through, he set his fork down. "I was an ass," he said, staring at the table, "for a long time." I waited. "I thought if I laughed first I'd never be the target," he continued. "Turns out it just made me someone I didn't like." I nodded. Fear does that. He looked up. "You don't have to forgive me." "I know," I said, "but I will." He exhaled, something loosening in him. We talked then about ordinary things, work, aches, plans that didn't involve proving anything. When we stood to leave, he didn't clap me on the shoulder. He hugged me, brief and careful. Progress wears many costumes. My father changed in ways that were quieter but deeper. He corrected people now gently but publicly when they edged toward old habits. He introduced me by name and stopped there. He asked questions not about my job's secrets, but about my days, my sleep, the books I was reading. He learned slowly to be curious without interrogating. One afternoon he asked if I wanted to help him clean out the garage. It was the kind of invitation he used to reserve for my brother. We spent hours sorting bolts and paint cans, deciding what to keep and what to let go. At one point he held up a bent wrench and smiled. "This one still works," he said. "It just looks wrong." I laughed. He did too. The metaphor hung between us, obvious and unforced. As for me, I returned to my routines with a steadier spine. Work continued demanding and quiet. My sedan continued to do its job, unnoticed, reliable, exactly what it was designed to be. Sometimes at stoplights I caught people glancing at it and then away, uninterested. That felt like success. I thought often about how easily worth gets confused with price, especially in families that learned early to measure love with ledger lines. The most dangerous lie Carol ever told wasn't about money. It was the idea that visibility equals value, that if something isn't admired, it must be lacking. I had lived long enough to know the opposite can be true. The safest things don't announce themselves. The strongest people don't need an audience. At the next end-of-year gathering, a full 12 months later, there was no unveiling in the driveway. No numbers were spoken aloud. We stayed inside, passing dishes, telling stories that didn't require a punchline at anyone's expense. When someone asked about my car, my father answered first. "It gets her where she's going," he said. "That's what matters." I met his eyes and nodded. That was enough. Later, as I left, Carol handed me a container of leftovers and said, "Drive safe." The words were neutral, unarmed. I thanked her and meant it. Outside, the night was clear. I unlocked my car, felt the familiar weight of the door, and settled in. The engine turned over without complaint. The road waited. As I pulled away, I thought about all the years I had spent shrinking to fit rooms that mistook noise for importance. I thought about how easily people laugh when a target has been chosen for them, and how quickly that laughter dies when the truth steps into the light. Mostly I thought about standards, how they change a room even when they're spoken softly. You don't need to humiliate someone to reclaim your dignity. You don't need to list your credentials to deserve respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be priced. If you're listening to this and you've ever been measured by the wrong yardstick, your body, your job, the car you drive, I hope you remember this: your value doesn't fluctuate with the market. It isn't determined by who laughs the loudest in the driveway. It lives in how you carry yourself when the lights turn on and someone tries to make a spectacle of you. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. I'd love to know what part stayed with you the most. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. We share stories like this every day, stories about dignity, boundaries, and quiet strength. So if you don't want to miss the next one, consider subscribing. Let's keep walking this road together.